In ancient Rome, the most shocking spectacles weren't the battles. They were the perverted public humiliations staged as official rituals. Women stripped and displayed as evidence of their families' crimes. Noblemen forced into obscene reenactments meant to invert their status. Condemned prisoners tied, exposed, and positioned so crowds could judge every inch of their shame before beasts finished the script. These acts weren't accidents of cruelty. They were state-approved performances, engineered to break reputation, sexuality, and identity in front of tens of thousands. If you value the record over the legend, stay. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The Colosseum, stone, heat, and spectacle, was not built for death alone. It was designed for display, to turn punishment into choreography and morality into theatre. At its core lay a cruel equation that Rome never denied. The more intimate the humiliation, the stronger the empire's control. When Lucia, the 19-year-old daughter of a senator, was led into the arena in 73 AD, she wasn't being punished for a crime. Her body was being repurposed as proof, the living, breathing receipt of her father's disloyalty. Her thin tunic, soaked until transparent, clung to her skin by design. Her chains were polished, not for restraint, but for the glint that caught sunlight and eyes alike. Around her neck hung a placard, the traitor's daughter who thought herself above Rome. She was not to die quickly. That would be too merciful, too private. Instead, 4 trained actors entered the sand, men not of the army, but of the theatre. Their script, approved by a magistrate, was titled The Queen Who Defied the Law. Lucia was forced to play the lead role, her throne carved from scrap wood, her crown woven from filth. The crowd roared, not in outrage, but in recognition. They had seen this play before. Every noble family in Rome knew the subtext. Your honor exists only because the emperor allows it. For 3 hours, Lucia was made to act out her own destruction. She was mocked, paraded, stripped of symbols, forced to speak lines confessing her father's sins. Every gesture had been calculated to invert her identity. Each movement rehearsed to extract maximum humiliation without immediate death. It was pain as performance, degradation as governance. And it was far from unique. Roman archives describe similar rituals repeated across the empire, from Carthage to Corinth, Antioch to Gaul. Officials called them exempla, examples. Historians later softened the term to public punishment. But the records are clear. These were not moments of justice. They were calibrated moral theatre, meticulously staged to remind 50 million subjects that Rome could violate not just the body, but the very concept of dignity. In this system, humiliation was not collateral damage. It was the product itself. Each scream confirmed the empire's moral architecture. Each shiver of the crowd, a civic duty fulfilled. Rome's perversion was never hidden. It was codified, financed, and applauded. The girl in the arena was never meant to survive. But even if she did, she would never outlive what the crowd had seen. Her shame became public property. And that, in Rome, was the most efficient form of execution. The Colosseum was not an anomaly. It was an institution, a factory where Rome converted humiliation into law. Every block of marble, every seat cut from volcanic stone existed for one purpose: to prove that no human body was sacred once the state declared it public property. Lucia's degradation was not an act of sadism, it was administration. A performance signed, sealed, and scheduled by the same government that managed taxes and aqueducts. Roman law called these punishments exempla, examples to be seen, memorized, and feared. The spectacle was not just for justice, but for pedagogy. "Let the punishment teach," one magistrate wrote. And so the punishments became scripts. The state wrote the lines, the condemned became the actors, and the audience learned its lesson. Virtue existed only under supervision. Every humiliation began with a decree. The law demanded that the body of the guilty, or of those associated with guilt, must be exposed in the sight of the people. Citizens watched because the empire told them to watch, and because to look away was dangerous. In Rome, indifference was treason. The crowd itself became the weapon. Tens of thousands of eyes transformed into instruments of punishment. The architecture made this clear. The amphitheater was designed not to contain violence, but to magnify it. Its curves focused sound like a funnel. A whisper of pain could echo to the uppermost row. The sand was white, so that every drop of blood, every mark of shame was visible. Beneath the arena, tunnels branched like veins. One for the condemned, one for the beasts, one for the actors, one for the magistrate's servants carrying the orders that timed every movement. Nothing was spontaneous. Even the screams were scheduled. Humiliation was an economy. Rome paid for degradation the way it paid for roadwork or temples. Wealthy citizens financed public punishments as political investments. Each event a chance to display loyalty to the emperor. Graffiti preserved on the walls of Pompeii boasts of men who sponsored justice. Officials bid for contracts to supply actors, chains, and costumes. Animal traders profited from selling lions. Playwrights earned fees for writing mythological parodies in which condemned prisoners reenacted sins before being executed. Pain had receipts. Cruelty had invoices. It was a perfect circle of profit and control. The empire did not need to hide its violence because the violence paid for itself. Each humiliation was entertainment, morality, and propaganda fused together. A civic duty disguised as pleasure. Rome called it justice. The crowd called it joy. The philosophers justified it. Seneca, the Stoic moralist, insisted that watching punishment purified the soul. Seeing others suffer teaches men restraint. Cicero called it the theatre of order, claiming that degradation reminded citizens of virtue. These words disguised a darker truth, that the audience was being trained to accept cruelty as education. It was moral inversion. The empire taught its people that virtue required witnessing shame, that justice required participation in pain. The process was always the same. First, isolation. The condemned kept in darkness, deprived of sleep and sound, until imagination turned fear into madness. Then came exposure, the sudden blinding light of the arena, the stripping of clothes, the placard hung around the neck like a product label. Next, performance, forced to recite confessions, to reenact myths of betrayal, to move on command, as if their gestures could restore the order they had supposedly violated. Then, reversal, roles inverted, nobility reduced to parody, slaves forced to impersonate gods. And finally, witnessing, the moment the crowd accepted the transformation. That was when the punishment ended, When the victim ceased to exist as a person and became what the law had decreed, an example, what Rome achieved through this ritual was something unprecedented in history. It created a culture where shame was more powerful than death. The condemned did not simply lose life. They lost the right to privacy, the final boundary between person and state. Every citizen knew it could happen to them, and that knowledge kept the empire intact. Fear was too abstract to sustain control forever, but shame was permanent. Shame lived in the gaze of others. The bureaucrats of Rome understood that perfectly. They wrote manuals on how to calibrate punishment so that pain lasted, but did not kill. The condemned must remain conscious. One surviving note reads, "For death ends instruction." The magistrates became choreographers of agony. They balanced cruelty with endurance, ensuring that the victim could neither escape through death nor through madness. To survive was to continue the lesson. Even the geography of Rome reflected this ideology. The Forum, where law was read, the baths, where the body was displayed, the amphitheatre, where the body was destroyed, all were linked by streets of triumphal arches, monuments to the empire's ability to turn humiliation into architecture. Travelers entering the city passed under stone inscriptions proclaiming virtues per exemplum, virtue through example. The empire announced, in granite and blood, that the public body was its most efficient form of propaganda. In this way, Rome became the first civilization to institutionalize spectacle. Its cruelty was not random. It was rehearsed, not hidden. It was sanctified. The empire's greatest innovation was not the aqueduct or the legion, but the system that made suffering both profitable and moral. Every scream that echoed through the Colosseum was a civic transaction, proof that Rome could turn degradation into devotion. When the crowd finally left, they carried home more than entertainment. They carried obedience. They had learned, once again, that the empire ruled not by killing, but by redefining what it meant to be seen. Rome's cruelty did not end when the arenas emptied. It seeped into every corridor of civic life, into the language of law, into the posture of its citizens. What began as spectacle became social order. Humiliation was no longer confined to the condemned. It became the grammar of power itself. To be Roman was to perform submission before authority, and to watch others perform it daily as proof of belonging. By the 1st century AD, Rome had perfected the ritual of degradation into bureaucracy. Each punishment left behind not only scars, but documentation. Reports detailed the condemned's demeanor under shame, how long they trembled, how the crowd reacted. Magistrates submitted these notes to the Senate as evidence of effective governance. The empire had created what modern historians would call administrative cruelty, the routinization of pain as paperwork. Even outside the Colosseum, the theatre of humiliation continued. In the Forum, debtors were stripped to the waist and chained to pillars, while passers-by mocked them with chants. At weddings, widows accused of infidelity were forced to attend dressed in mourning clothes, symbols of their moral death. In the baths, slaves were ordered to stand motionless for hours so that senators could debate whether stillness was a virtue. The public learned to measure virtue by how well one endured exposure. Roman society had become a hall of mirrors. Every act of degradation reflected the hierarchy that sustained it. The emperor humiliated senators to remind them that their status depended on his favor. Senators humiliated clients to prove their own superiority. Husbands shamed wives. Masters shamed slaves. Citizens mocked foreigners. Each layer of society mirrored the next, until cruelty became indistinguishable from culture. The empire no longer needed to invent punishments. The people performed them instinctively. Philosophers continued to dress this sickness in rhetoric. Seneca called humility a discipline of the soul, yet, in practice, it meant obedience to humiliation. Epictetus told slaves to accept insult as proof of divine order. Even Marcus Aurelius, remembered as the philosopher king, ordered public executions in the name of virtue. They all preached endurance because endurance kept the system intact. The empire's moralists became its apologists. The women of Rome understood this most cruelly. They bore the double burden of being both citizens and symbols. A noble woman's body was a message, her modesty a reflection of her family's honor, her exposure a warning to others. When a husband was accused of treason, his wife's clothes could condemn her. To appear in public unveiled, to speak too loudly, to stand too proudly, each gesture risked accusation. The Senate decreed that a woman's public visibility must remain under male control. The logic was simple: control the body, and you control the lineage. Lucia's fate had long been sealed before she entered the arena. Her punishment was not for what she did, but for what her father represented: defiance in the face of imperial spectacle. She became the instrument through which Rome reaffirmed its myth, that the empire's power flowed not from the gods, but from its capacity to regulate shame. Her suffering was theatre, but the meaning was political. This is where Rome's system achieved its most terrifying perfection. It learned to outsource cruelty. By making the public complicit, the state no longer needed to be present in every act of control. The gaze of others replaced the sword. A senator could be destroyed not by execution, but by laughter. A soldier could be broken not by wounds, but by the fear of ridicule. Entire families could be erased by rumor alone. Rome had found a way to make every citizen an extension of its authority. The architecture of humiliation expanded across the provinces. Amphitheaters rose in Carthage, Tarragona, Londinium. Provincial governors replicated the rituals precisely. The same announcements, the same sequence of acts, the same vocabulary of shame. Even conquered peoples began to imitate the practice, staging smaller spectacles to prove their loyalty. Humiliation became imperial language, a dialect understood from the Nile to the Rhine. Archaeologists uncovering inscriptions from these arenas found something chilling: the word iustitia, justice, engraved beside scenes of exposure. To Rome, there was no contradiction. Justice meant visibility. Guilt was not determined by truth, but by the ability to endure being seen. The public body replaced the courtroom. The victim's silence was the verdict. Yet, behind the applause lay another truth. The empire itself was addicted to its reflection. Each spectacle fed its illusion of moral authority, but the more it consumed, the more fragile that authority became. What the crowd saw in the arena was not justice. It was themselves, stripped and obedient. The empire's obsession with controlling shame revealed its deepest fear: losing control of the mirror. By the 2nd century AD, as new religions spread through the empire, cracks began to appear in that mirror. Christians, refusing to bow or participate in public rituals, introduced a new form of defiance. the sanctification of humiliation. When they were paraded naked, they called it purification. When mocked, they sang. Rome could not comprehend this inversion. It had built its empire on the equation that shame equals submission. But here were people turning shame into glory. The machinery of humiliation had met a form of resistance it could not calculate. Still, for 2 more centuries, the system endured. The spectacles continued. The ledgers of pain grew longer. The empire's architects kept designing better ways to display degradation. Raised platforms, rotating stages, mirrored shields that caught the light on skin. Rome kept looking at itself, certain that the reflection proved its immortality. But every reflection consumes the thing it mirrors. Every empire built on spectacle eventually performs for ghosts. By the time Rome fell, the Colosseum was already crumbling, its seats looted, its sand turned to dust. Yet the logic of humiliation survived. The empire's body died, but its mirror remained. What Rome invented, the ritual of public shame as governance, would outlive it by millennia. It would travel through inquisitions, executions, public trials, and televised confessions. The crowd would change, the costumes would change, but the choreography would remain the same. The empire of mirrors never ended. It only modernized. If the Colosseum was Rome's theatre of humiliation, then the triumph, the grand victory procession through the city, was its travelling stage. What began as a celebration of conquest evolved into a ritual of domination where humiliation itself became a weapon more powerful than the sword. It was in these processions that Rome turned the defeat of enemies into moral propaganda, broadcasting submission as public entertainment. A Roman triumph followed strict choreography. At the front marched the senators, their purple-edged togas gleaming in the sun. Behind them came the musicians and priests, chanting hymns of purity. Then the spoils, chariots filled with gold, ivory, and statues torn from conquered temples. But the heart of the procession was the final act, the parade of captives. Kings, queens, generals, and their families were bound in chains, forced to walk barefoot through the streets as Roman citizens jeered. The conqueror's chariot rolled behind them, higher than the crowd, his face painted red like Jupiter himself. The message was unmistakable. The triumph was not just the celebration of victory. It was the conversion of human dignity into civic theatre. The captive's humiliation was as essential as the general's glory. The entire city became one colossal Colosseum. When Titus returned from the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, his triumph redefined the ritual forever. The streets of Rome became a corridor of degradation. Jewish priests were forced to carry the sacred menorah, its golden arms glinting like mock sunlight. Families of rebel leaders marched in silence, their children clutching broken fragments of the temple scrolls. At the end of the procession came Simon Bar Giora, one of Jerusalem's defenders, dragged in chains, stripped of armor, paraded before the Senate, and strangled beneath the arch of Septimius Severus as the crowd cheered. His death was not military necessity, it was administrative punctuation. The triumph systemized shame on a global scale. Rome's power lay not only in conquest, but in recording conquest, turning pain into narrative. Chroniclers described each captive's expressions in detail: who cried, who resisted, who fainted. The more the enemy suffered, the more legitimate Rome's victory appeared. The empire was building its own mythology through degradation. Art preserved this hierarchy. Reliefs on the Arch of Titus show the menorah carried by captives whose faces are carved in exquisite misery. Their anguish was not an accident of the sculptor's hand, it was design. The reliefs functioned as imperial propaganda, reminding every passerby that submission was beautiful when framed by stone. The empire monumentalized humiliation, turning shame into architecture. Economically, the triumph was lucrative. Cities paid tribute to host them. Artisans built decorations, and merchants sold souvenirs. Pain became a commodity, a marketplace of defeat. For Rome, degradation was not only moral theatre, but fiscal infrastructure. Every conquered body contributed to the empire's GDP of shame. Yet, beneath the pageantry lay a darker truth. Rome feared the conquered, even as it displayed them. The act of public humiliation was an insurance policy, a ritual that turned fear into dominance. To march the enemy naked through the capital was to declare that resistance had no afterlife. The triumph was political exorcism. For the spectators, it was moral reassurance. Watching the defeated suffer affirmed their place within the empire's moral hierarchy. The crowd learned to equate justice with degradation, to see the spectacle, not as cruelty, but as cosmic order. The cheering was not bloodlust, it was relief. Rome's citizens needed these processions to convince themselves that the empire's violence was virtue. But for the captives, humiliation became history's most durable sentence. After the triumph, many were sold into slavery or executed in amphitheaters. Their bodies vanished, but their shame remained eternal. Engraved in marble, echoed in poetry, retold in triumphal oaths. Rome understood that public degradation could immortalize submission more effectively than death. Death was private. Humiliation was permanent. Even emperors weaponized their own image through the language of triumph. Nero staged mock victories over imaginary foes to remind the Senate that humiliation was imperial privilege. When Caligula returned from his failed campaign in Germania, he paraded soldiers dressed as prisoners of war to maintain the illusion of conquest. The lie did not matter. What mattered was the appearance of domination. Rome's moral theatre depended on the performance of shame, not the reality of victory. The philosopher Pliny once remarked that the triumph civilized the Romans. He was wrong. It anesthetized them. By turning humiliation into art, Rome lost its capacity for empathy. Each procession numbed the public conscience further, until cruelty felt like order, and order felt divine. Yet within this system lay a seed of self-destruction. The more the empire glorified humiliation, the more it needed new victims to sustain belief. Each triumph demanded another conquered people, another city to burn, another body to display. The empire's ideology fed on spectacle until it consumed itself. When the triumphs finally ceased in the 4th century, they left behind more than ruins. They left behind a psychological blueprint for control. Future empires would follow it. Medieval Inquisition, colonial parades, public executions, and even modern propaganda, all descended from Rome's original theatre of degradation. In the end, the triumph was not about war or peace. It was about the management of perception. Rome's greatest victory was not over its enemies, but over the meaning of dignity itself. Lucia's humiliation in the arena and the captive's humiliation in the streets were two faces of the same philosophy, the belief that power is proven through the public destruction of pride. And that belief would survive long after the empire's walls crumbled. If the triumph was Rome's celebration of conquered nations, then damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts, was its ritual for destroying individuals. It was the empire's most theatrical form of execution, where punishment merged with pornography, religion, and politics into a single horrifying performance. The Colosseum was the altar, the condemned the offering, and the crowd the congregation. By the 1st century AD, damnatio ad bestias had become institutionalized. The law defined it not as execution, but as spectacle justice, a punishment pleasing to the people and instructive to the wicked. Those who defied the state, dishonored the gods, or merely offended the emperor's pride could be sentenced to this fate. But the victims were rarely soldiers or rebels. They were often slaves, women, foreigners, bodies the empire could legally strip of identity. The ritual followed precise choreography. At dawn, trumpets announced the games. Vendors sold figs and wine outside the amphitheater. Inside, the sand glowed white under the sun. The condemned were led in through the gate of death, their wrists bound, their names replaced by titles like the adulteress, the blasphemer, or the thief who mocked the emperor. They were not people anymore. They were symbols, embodiments of moral failure. Before the beasts appeared, there was performance. Actors reenacted myths that justified the punishment. Pasiphae and the bull, Leda and the swan, Orpheus torn apart by animals. The condemned were forced to play the roles. A woman accused of infidelity might be dressed as Pasiphae, locked inside a wooden cow and gored to death by a bull. A man accused of treason might play Orpheus, lured into the arena to charm the beasts before being mauled alive. The line between theatre and torture vanished. This was the essence of Rome's perversion. The body was punished through myth, as if cruelty could be disguised as storytelling. The audience was not witnessing an execution. They were watching morality, performed through flesh. Every torn limb was a lesson, every scream a sermon. Lucia's body had been used to prove loyalty. The victims of damnatio ad bestias were used to prove divinity. The emperor himself presided as the earthly echo of Jupiter, the god who judged through thunder and spectacle. When beasts were released, he raised his thumb, not to command death, but to signal that the lesson was complete. The logistics behind the ritual were staggering. Hundreds of exotic animals, lions from Numidia, leopards from Syria, bears from the Alps, were imported, starved, and trained to kill on cue. They were kept in dark cages beneath the arena, their hunger timed to the minute. Engineers constructed elevators to raise cages into the light. The gates were painted crimson so that when blood sprayed, it blended with the design. Nothing was accidental. Rome treated suffering as engineering. Economically, the spectacle was ruinous yet necessary. A single festival could cost millions of sesterces. But emperors saw it as investment. Each act of cruelty bought silence, loyalty, distraction. Augustus, Tiberius, Nero all understood the arithmetic. Feed the people blood, and they will forget bread. The philosophers called these spectacles ludi morales, moral games. But what moral could survive the sight of a woman eaten alive for sport? To justify the cruelty, senators claimed it was purification. The condemned, they said, returned their corruption to the earth. The crowd repeated these words until they sounded true. What made the ritual so effective was its intimacy. The amphitheater compressed distance. The spectators could see the eyes of the dying, could smell the fear. The condemned often locked gazes with those watching. In that moment, the audience became both judge and accomplice. It was not the beasts who destroyed the victims. It was the gaze. Rome's cruelty worked because it disguised itself as order. There was always a script, a reason, a priest, a judge. Everything was legal. Every death was documented. The empire did not see savagery, it saw symmetry. In one recorded case from Carthage, a young Christian woman named Perpetua was sentenced to damnatio ad bestias. She was 19, the same age as Lucia. The court described her as serene when she entered the arena. She was dressed as a priestess, her hair tied up so as not to appear disheveled in death. A mad cow was released. It charged, tossed her into the air, broke her ribs. Yet, when she fell, she adjusted her tunic to cover her thighs. Even as her bones shattered, she protected her modesty. The crowd gasped, not in pity, but in awe. To Rome, even the victim's dignity became performance. Perpetua's final act was to guide the executioner's sword to her own throat. The chroniclers wrote of her as a martyr to shame, but what they truly recorded was Rome's ultimate contradiction, an empire that worshipped virtue and staged its violation as art. The victims of damnatio ad bestias were erased from citizenship, but immortalized in architecture. Their blood soaked the sand that still lies beneath the Colosseum's ruins. The grooves carved into the marble benches, the fingerprints of spectators gripping in ecstasy, remain fossilized reminders of how deeply Rome's system of humiliation reached into the human psyche. These were not moments of madness. They were the empire functioning exactly as designed. Rome didn't kill to punish, it killed to perform. And every performance was a reflection of itself. Rome prided itself on being a civilization of law, not chaos. But beneath the marble rhetoric of justice lay a darker scripture, one written not in ink, but in human flesh. The empire's cruelty was not wild or spontaneous. It was codified, administered, and archived. The degradation of a body was as lawful as the signing of a decree. The Roman jurists, men like Ulpian and Gaius, were the empire's theologians of humiliation. They wrote clauses specifying who could be shamed, how, and why. A slave could be beaten publicly for insolence. A freedman could be branded for deceit. A senator could not be whipped, but he could be stripped of his toga before the forum. Each punishment was proportioned to rank, not crime. Dignity itself had become currency, traded and taxed according to social class. This legal structure was called infamia, literally the state of being without reputation. Once declared infames, a person was civilly dead. They could not testify in court, hold office, or marry a citizen. Their signature meant nothing. Their word had no weight. The law did not simply punish them, it erased their personhood. What made infamia terrifying was its permanence. Unlike execution, it left the body alive, but the identity annihilated. A senator convicted of corruption could live in Rome, walk the same streets, even speak the same language, but no one would answer him. Servants would not meet his gaze. Merchants would not sell to him. He became a living ghost, proof that in Rome, erasure was a sentence more severe than death. Historians often describe the Roman legal system as brilliant, rational, the the foundation of Western jurisprudence. But behind its logic was moral theatre. Every clause had a stage direction. The accused did not stand in court alone. They were surrounded by spectators, magistrates, scribes, each recording how shame should be performed. Trials were not about truth. They were about choreography. The philosopher Seneca, himself a lawyer and advisor to Nero, once wrote that a man stripped of honor walks naked even when clothed. He meant it metaphorically, but in Rome it was literal. To declare someone infamous was to make their body property of the gaze. Their humiliation became communal ritual, binding the city together through shared contempt. Women suffered the law's cruelty in ways uniquely perverse. A woman accused of adultery could be exiled without trial if her husband invoked Lex Julia de Adulteriis, the law Augustus introduced to preserve virtue. But that law also required public declaration of her shame. Her dowry was confiscated, her name inscribed on tablets displayed in the forum. Citizens walked past and read her downfall as civic entertainment. The law turned morality into spectacle. The economic machinery followed naturally. Once branded infames, individuals lost access to property and inheritance. Their estates were absorbed by the state or auctioned to senators. The bureaucracy of degradation became profitable. Each destroyed life funding the empire that destroyed it. But Rome's lawmakers did not see themselves as cruel. They believed they were preserving order. Cicero wrote, "Humiliation purifies the citizen, as flame refines metal." It was an elegant lie, one that turned suffering into moral currency. To be degraded was to serve the Republic, even in ruin. The psychological precision of Roman punishment remains chilling. Infamia worked because it required no physical torture. It weaponized social visibility. Every Roman's worth depended on being seen with respect. To be seen with contempt, to be pointed at, whispered about, shunned, was annihilation. The entire system relied on the human need to belong. Rome's bureaucrats mastered what modern states would later rediscover, that control of reputation is control of life. The empire invented not just public humiliation, but institutional shame, a form of governance where people policed themselves to avoid disgrace. No whip, no chain, only fear of exposure. In this architecture of law, cruelty was moralized, and morality was bureaucratized. Paperwork replaced empathy. A magistrate could condemn a man without raising his voice, because the law itself had already done the violence. One surviving court inscription captures the essence of this ideology. It reads, "Let his name be silent, his memory void, his body unburied." This was damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, a punishment reserved for those whose existence Rome wished to delete. Their statues were smashed, their portraits erased, their names chiseled out of stone. The empire that built libraries also built forgetting. In the Senate records, this was called purification. But in the ruins, archaeologists still find marble torsos with the heads hacked off, mute witnesses to a civilization that worshipped the idea of order while feeding on obliteration. Lucia's body had been made a spectacle, but in the law courts, Rome performed a different kind of killing. Erasure through procedure. No arena, no blood, just ink, silence, and exile. The result was the same. A person reduced to a warning. The Colosseum burned flesh to keep the crowd obedient. The courts burned identity to keep society obedient. In both arenas, the applause was law. The more one studies Rome's legal codes, the clearer it becomes that its cruelty was not deviation, it was design. The empire did not collapse from barbarism. It collapsed because its justice became indistinguishable from theatre. By the height of the empire, humiliation had become its own institution. An empire within the empire. It had architects, accountants, engineers, and priests. It required supply chains, labor, and record keeping. Rome industrialized cruelty. Every spectacle, every branding, every scream was part of a system that ran with the precision of its aqueducts and the profitability of its grain trade. Beneath the Colosseum, archaeologists have uncovered a labyrinth of corridors and elevators known as the Hypogeum. It was not simply a holding area for beasts and prisoners. It was a factory of emotion. Workers timed the release of leopards, bulls, and victims according to written schedules. Levers creaked, pulleys turned, and cages rose from the ground like the resurrection of nightmares. The Romans had turned engineering into theology. Pain was a mechanism, and awe was its output. Inscriptions from the administrators who managed the games reveal something remarkable. Ledgers, meticulous records of the condemned, names, crimes, ages, origins, even notes on audience response. In one tablet, a scribe comments that the crowd grew restless after a victim fainted too early, leading the editor to adjust pacing. The implication is staggering. Rome did not simply punish, it produced content. It managed cruelty as entertainment analytics. The logistics required cooperation across the empire. Provincial governors sent a steady flow of condemned criminals to Rome. Traders delivered exotic animals from Africa and Asia. Slave dealers supplied victims whose degradation was guaranteed by law. Every amphitheater, from Gaul to Syria, operated on the same blueprint, standardized like military bases. The empire's unity was not just built on language or law, it was built on the synchronization of humiliation. The economic infrastructure was vast. The lanii, butchers, processed carcasses after spectacles to sell meat at discount. Artisans crafted wax masks depicting dying gladiators. Tavern owners outside the Colosseum paid rent to the state for space, selling heroes' wine to spectators after executions. Even the blood was not wasted. It was collected and sold as a supposed cure for epilepsy. Suffering was not only sacred, it was monetized. Rome's cruelty survived because it was profitable. When moral justification faltered, balance sheets kept the system running. Senators who condemned prisoners to the arena also held shares in the companies that supplied the beasts. Moral hierarchy and market economy merged seamlessly. Violence was not excess, it was enterprise. But the system needed justification to mask its perversion. That justification came through ritual. Before each spectacle, priests sprinkled incense and declared the arena sanctified. Victims were called sacrifices. The crowd believed they were not watching murder, but purification. When the lions tore flesh, it was said that sin was consumed. That Rome had found the perfect equilibrium between sin and ceremony, an empire that sinned as it prayed. The machinery of shame extended beyond the amphitheater. In the workshops of sculptors, conquered enemies were carved kneeling beneath Roman victors. In frescoes, naked captives pleaded before generals who looked away in serene superiority. In household mosaics, citizens dined over depictions of chained barbarians. Even domestic art carried the language of domination. Every Roman home was a miniature Colosseum. The education system trained the next generation to sustain it. Boys learned virtues, the virtue of manly discipline, by watching slaves flogged in public. Philosophers taught that pain ennobled the soul, that suffering made citizens moral. The empire's curriculum was built on the spectacle of endurance. Compassion was rewritten as weakness. But the most insidious part of this machinery was how willingly ordinary Romans participated. No emperor could force 50,000 people to cheer unless they wanted to. They came by choice. Farmers, soldiers, merchants, children. They ate, laughed, and applauded as others were stripped and broken. They learned to feel righteous while watching horror. The Colosseum did not corrupt them. It reflected what they already were. Contemporary writers noticed the transformation. Juvenal, Rome's bitter satirist, wrote that, "We have grown to love the stench of blood as we love the smell of wine." He meant it literally. The arena air carried a metallic scent that clung to the audience as they left. Rome's citizens wore that scent home like incense, proof they had communed with the empire's gods of order. Yet even within the system, there were cracks, moments when the machinery faltered. In a letter, Pliny the Younger described watching a spectacle where a lion refused to kill a trembling man. The audience fell silent, unsure whether to cheer or curse. For one brief instant, the script failed. The empire had no language for mercy, and that silence terrified them more than blood ever could. Still, the system adapted. When compassion threatened to surface, new rituals of mockery drowned it out. The crowd was taught to laugh instead of doubt. The machinery recalibrated itself. More beasts, louder trumpets, longer screams. Rome's greatest invention was not architecture or law, it was emotional control. Every empire learns from its mechanisms. The Romans learned that you could build loyalty from horror, obedience from laughter, faith from spectacle. Their system worked because it felt participatory, because the citizens believed that by witnessing pain, they were protecting civilization itself. Lucia's humiliation, the triumphs, the damnatio ad bestias, the infamia decrees, all were gears in this vast apparatus. And the gears turned flawlessly, grinding bodies into policy, shame into currency, and cruelty into order. Rome's machinery of shame did not break. When the empire fell, its parts were inherited by monarchs, inquisitors, bureaucrats, and screens. The technology changed, but the principle endured. Control through spectacle, silence through exposure. And the hum of that ancient machinery still echoes beneath every system that mistakes visibility for justice. Even after the arenas emptied, Rome kept performing. It could not stop. The rituals of humiliation had burrowed too deeply into the empire's bloodstream. When the crowds no longer filled the Colosseum, the stage shifted to courtrooms, forums, and statues. The empire learned to humiliate not with beasts or whips, but with memory itself. The Romans called it damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. It was not execution, but deletion. When the Senate declared someone condemned, their name was scraped from every inscription. Their portraits were mutilated, their faces chiseled off, their likenesses recarved into new emperors. A man's history could be rewritten, born overnight, his triumphs reassigned to others. His body might still exist, but his existence had already been revoked. This was not madness, it was policy. The Empire had discovered that erasure could be more powerful than death. Death created martyrs, forgetting erased rebellion. A corpse can inspire sympathy, but a blank space cannot. Archaeologists have found statues with hollow sockets where eyes once were, cheeks hacked away, chisel marks still visible like surgical scars. Each strike was an act of political surgery, removing not only the face but the memory it carried. The empire that immortalized itself in marble also weaponized marble to unmake its own ghosts. The most infamous case was that of Emperor Domitian. When he was assassinated in 96 AD, the Senate ordered his memory obliterated. His name was removed from monuments. His coinage was melted. Even his birthday was cursed in the civic calendar. Yet, the paradox was immediate. To erase him required recording the order to erase him. His name survived precisely because it was condemned. Rome could never escape its own obsession with documentation. It archived its amnesia. This theatre of memory served a political purpose. Every act of erasure reaffirmed imperial authority. The state alone decided who was remembered and who was silenced. History became a tool of obedience. Citizens learned to read absence as warning. The blank spaces in inscriptions whispered louder than any decree. You can be unmade. The humiliation extended beyond the dead. The families of condemned men were forced to witness the destruction of their ancestors' images. Sons were made to hold the chisels that struck their fathers' names. Daughters were paraded through the streets as the offspring of nothing. The empire turned lineage itself into spectacle. Philosophers rationalized the practice. They claimed that memory was dangerous when it glorified tyranny or sin. In their view, erasure was moral hygiene. But beneath that moral facade was terror. Rome feared its own past, feared that one day its cruelty would outlive its glory. The destruction of faces was not cleansing, it was confession. In time, the process of erasure became so common that citizens began to anticipate it. Sculptors intentionally left stone faces unfinished, waiting to see whether the subject would survive political shifts. Artists learned to carve heads separately from bodies, so statues could be repurposed when power changed. The empire had turned even art into a flexible tool of forgetting. Meanwhile, poets chronicled the spectacle in secret. Martial wrote of marble that weeps for the memory it lost. Juvenal sneered that Rome remembers only what she destroys. These were dangerous words, critiques disguised as satire. The poets knew that truth, like marble, could be smoothed, but never erased completely. The ordinary Romans, too, played their part in this theatre. When a condemned man's image was removed, neighbors watched in silence, pretending not to remember. Forgetting became civic virtue. To recall too vividly was to risk guilt by association. Public amnesia was loyalty disguised as ignorance. And so the empire's cruelty evolved again, from the spectacle of pain to the spectacle of silence. The Colosseum's sand had absorbed enough blood. Now Rome learned to make absence perform the same function. This system of erasure reveals something even darker about Rome's psychology. It no longer needed violence to terrify. The threat of invisibility was enough. The citizen lived under two equal fears: exposure and obliteration. To be seen was to risk humiliation. To be forgotten was to cease existing. The empire held both powers and alternated them with surgical precision. In that sense, damnatio memoriae was the empire's final evolution. It perfected cruelty by removing the need for cruelty. It achieved control without corpses, obedience without whips. The bureaucrats no longer needed to stain their hands. Their chisels did the work. Their decrees made reality vanish. But memory resists even empires. The faces Rome tried to erase still emerge from its ruins, half-smashed, eyeless, yet stubbornly human. The very cracks meant to destroy identity have preserved it, fossilized in defiance. Every gouged inscription is now an indictment. Every hollow face a reminder that power cannot fully dictate what is remembered. Lucia's story, forgotten for centuries, belongs to the same tradition of buried memory. She was one of thousands turned into silence, humiliated, erased, unrecorded. Yet, archaeology, the enemy of oblivion, keeps finding them. Beneath the stones, the forgotten speak again, not as rebels, but as evidence. Rome's greatest lie was that history belonged to the victors. Its greatest mistake was writing that lie in stone, because stone endures longer than empire. When Rome could no longer justify its cruelty through law or spectacle, it found a new sanctuary: religion. What began as the worship of gods through sacrifice evolved into the worship of power through suffering. The empire baptized its violence, transforming humiliation into holiness. In its earliest days, Roman religion was transactional. You offered blood, grain, or wine, and the gods repaid with fortune. But as the empire expanded and absorbed new faiths, the logic shifted. Pain itself became sacred. The victim was no longer just a criminal or a foreigner. They were an offering whose degradation pleased the divine order. The ritual of sacrifice merged seamlessly with the logic of public punishment. Priests stood beside magistrates in the amphitheaters. Prayers were recited before executions. When beasts devoured Christians, the crowd shouted, "Deo vindice," God avenged. The line between altar and arena blurred until both served the same purpose: to sanctify violence through choreography. This merging of cruelty and faith was not hypocrisy, it was philosophy. Stoic thinkers like Seneca and Epictetus argued that suffering was necessary to test virtue. To endure humiliation calmly was proof of strength. To resist it was weakness. The empire seized on that idea. If pain purified, then Rome was the world's purifier. Every punishment became an act of cosmic order. Every death a sermon. But within that logic lay the seed of Rome's undoing. Because when pain becomes sacred, it can no longer be controlled. The same system that used humiliation to dominate began to create people who embraced it. People who saw in their suffering not defeat, but transcendence. The Christians were the first to weaponize Rome's own theology against it. They refused to offer incense to the emperor, calling it idolatry. They rejected Rome's rituals of humiliation, yet accepted the humiliation itself as divine proof. When they were stripped naked, they called it purification. When mocked, they sang. When executed, they prayed for their executioners. In trying to destroy them, Rome unintentionally made them indestructible. the Roman authorities were confounded. The old equation, pain equals obedience, no longer held. The spectators who had cheered gladiators began whispering about martyrs. The arena that once displayed imperial dominance became a stage for defiance cloaked in faith. The empire that had perfected the art of spectacle discovered a rival art more powerful, meaning. Perpetua's story was not isolated. Dozens of accounts survive. Christians thrown to beasts, burned alive, crucified upside down. Each record, meant to deter others, instead became scripture. Every humiliation became a psalm. The victims Rome branded as infamous became saints. The arenas Rome consecrated with blood became shrines. The system of public shame had inverted itself, but Rome refused to learn. Instead, it doubled down. Emperors like Decius and Diocletian issued edicts demanding universal sacrifice to the old gods. Refusal was treason. Across the provinces, the machinery of humiliation went into overdrive. Women were paraded through cities. Men were whipped until their skin came off in strips. Crowds watched with the same old hunger, but something was different now. The victims smiled. To a civilization built on hierarchy, this serenity was intolerable. Rome's power depended on visible fear. Yet here was an enemy who treated humiliation as communion, whose pain produced not terror, but unity. The empire that once mastered every weapon found itself disarmed by faith. The bureaucrats continued to write reports. Condemned to beasts, sang hymns until death. Tortured thrice, no confession. Burned, no resistance. The clerks could not comprehend what they were documenting. In their ledgers of discipline, they were unknowingly recording the empire's own moral collapse. Over time, the logic of Christian martyrdom began to infect the empire's own institutions. The language of purification that once justified executions was adopted by the persecuted. The imagery of sacrifice that once belonged to Jupiter and Mars was rewritten in the story of Christ. The cross, once a symbol of degradation, became the banner of salvation. Rome's greatest invention, the spectacle of humiliation, had been stolen and repurposed by its victims. When Constantine converted to Christianity in the 4th century, it was not a triumph of mercy, but a transfer of methods. The new faith inherited the old machinery. The amphitheaters closed, but the ritual remained. Public confession, penance, moral exposure. The victims of yesterday became the moral judges of tomorrow. Rome had not repented, it had rebranded. Yet, beneath the new robes, the old ideology pulsed on. The idea that suffering redeems, that humiliation cleanses, that order requires display. These became cornerstones of Christian civilization. The empire died, but its theology of pain survived, sanctified, and multiplied. Even centuries later, when inquisitors burned heretics and kings paraded prisoners in chains, the echoes of Rome were unmistakable. The same choreography, the same applause, the same holy rationalizations. The Colosseum had merely changed costumes. Rome's gospel of pain became Western civilization's inheritance. And somewhere beneath every monument, every sermon, every courtroom oath, the same logic hums, that suffering, properly displayed, is a form of truth. Lucia's humiliation was once performed to teach obedience. Perpetua's suffering transformed it into revelation. Together, they mark the moment when cruelty ceased to be a sin, and became a theology. Rome never truly fell. It ascended into our rituals, into our laws, into our faith. When the Western Empire crumbled in the 5th century, the Colosseum's arches stood hollow and wind-swept. The lions were gone, the marble seats cracked, and the sand turned to dust. But the system Rome built, the choreography of power through public degradation, did not die with the empire. It simply changed languages. The Middle Ages inherited Rome's bones, and with them its memory of spectacle. The church replaced the amphitheatre. The altar replaced the arena. The priest replaced the magistrate. The script remained the same. Confession became a subtler version of the old humiliation ritual. The sinner exposed, the priest as witness, the audience imagined as divine. Repentance was no longer a civic duty. It was a sacrament of shame. Where Rome once punished bodies to preserve order, Christendom punished souls to preserve faith. The Inquisition was its logical continuation. Judges of the faith called themselves custodes animae, keepers of souls, but their methods were Roman. They summoned the accused, demanded confession in public, and equated silence with guilt. Torture was called the question, a ritualized performance in which the condemned screams confirmed both their sin and the church's righteousness. The medieval square became the new Colosseum. There were stages for heretics, scaffolds for witches, and pyres for blasphemers. The crowd still gathered, prayed, and cheered. The flames crackled where once lions roared. On parchment, inquisitors quoted the same stoic maxims that senators once used. Pain purifies, exposure redeems. They were not barbarians reviving cruelty, they were scholars preserving it. Art, too, carried the legacy forward. Frescoes in cathedrals showed sinners twisted in torment, not as warning, but as spectacle. The faithful knelt beneath images of agony rendered in gold, and lapis lazuli. The same aesthetic that once glorified Roman conquest now glorified divine punishment. The spectacle of suffering became worship itself. But the most chilling continuity was psychological. Rome had taught the West to find moral reassurance in the humiliation of others. That reflex survived every reformation, every revolution. Each new system, secular or sacred, recycled the same formula. Expose the deviant, display their ruin, call it justice. The Enlightenment, which promised reason over cruelty, merely refined the choreography. Public executions became rational deterrents. The guillotine was praised as humane, the perfection of Roman efficiency. Crowds still gathered, just as they had under Caesar, to watch morality reaffirm itself through a clean, mechanized death. The empire's technology of control had survived in the machinery of enlightenment. And when the age of empire returned centuries later, British, French, Spanish, its conquerors cited Rome as precedent. The rhetoric was familiar: civilization through order, order through punishment, punishment through spectacle. Conquered peoples were paraded, photographed, exhibited in human zoos. Their humiliation was proof of European virtue, just as Lucia's had once been proof of Roman order. Even the 20th century, armed with machines far deadlier than swords, never escaped the Roman instinct. Governments filmed executions, broadcast trials, televised confessions. The stage had become global. Every regime that sought legitimacy learned the same lesson: control the narrative of shame, and you control the people. In the digital age, the Colosseum lives again. Only now it fits in the palm of a hand. The crowd no longer needs to gather in stone arenas. They assemble through screens, watching lives destroyed in real time. Public humiliation has become democratic. A single accusation, a viral image, a misstep, each can summon the same ancient ritual: exposure, judgment, annihilation. The crowd cheers, not with blood, but with clicks. The empire of mirrors has found its perfect form. We call it accountability, justice, truth. Rome called it exemplum, the example made visible. The language has changed, the logic has not. What Rome learned 2 millennia ago still governs us: that the destruction of one body, one name, one reputation can purify the rest. The historian Tacitus once wrote, "They make a desert and call it peace. Today, we make a spectacle and call it justice." Rome's ghost survives in our appetite for visibility, for punishment, for moral theatre disguised as truth. The forms are cleaner, the laws more humane, but the architecture of shame remains untouched. Lucia's body was destroyed to teach obedience. Perpetua's suffering was sanctified to teach faith. The modern citizen's humiliation, public, viral, unending, serves the same purpose: to remind us that belonging still depends on submission to the gaze. The Colosseum stands in ruins, but its idea has never been stronger. Every screen, every camera, every public outrage feeds it. The empire of exposure has no emperors, no priests, no beasts, only witnesses. And the witnesses are us. Because Rome's final victory was not territorial, it was psychological. It taught the world that to see is to rule, and to be seen is to obey. When the ledger closes and the noise fades, what remains is the same question that haunted every Roman arena. Do we cheer because they deserve it, or because we're afraid to be next? 2,000 years after the sand of the Colosseum first drank blood, the rituals Rome perfected still hum beneath civilization's surface, muted, modern, mechanized, yet unchanged in purpose. The architecture of shame has outlived its architects. What once required stone and steel now requires only attention. The Romans engineered obedience through spectacle. Modern power engineers it through visibility. Every citizen carries their own arena now, a screen, a feed, a lens through which lives are judged, archived, and erased. Rome's law of exposure has become a principle of modern governance. What is seen must be controlled. What is unseen must not exist. The empire of mirrors thrives because it no longer needs emperors. Its citizens are both audience and executioner, each trained to interpret humiliation as justice. The applause of the crowd has become the algorithm's pulse. We no longer need whips or chains. We have metrics. The same psychology that filled the Colosseum now fills timelines. A collective craving for moral confirmation through the destruction of others. And yet, the illusion of progress comforts us. We say we have evolved, that public punishment is barbaric, that law is civilized. But our punishments have only become abstract. We no longer destroy bodies, we destroy visibility. Careers vanish, reputations dissolve, voices are buried beneath curated silence. To be unseen is still to die. Rome would recognize the pattern. The 21st century is a cleaner Colosseum. Cameras replace torches, policies replace decrees, Comment sections replace the mob. The rituals of degradation have been democratized. Anyone can summon the crowd. Anyone can become its target. The performance never ends, because the empire no longer needs marble or blood to survive. It only needs participation. Historians used to argue that Rome's downfall began when its citizens stopped believing in its gods. They were wrong. Rome never required belief, only attention. The empire that ruled through spectacle could not die in silence. It simply dissolved into smaller theatres. Courts, churches, colonies, companies, screens. Wherever people gather to witness punishment, Rome resurrects itself. Its genius was not cruelty, but continuity. It understood that to endure, power must disguise itself as morality. The Romans called it pietas, duty disguised as virtue, obedience disguised as faith. Today we call it accountability, order, security. The words are different, the stage remains. Lucia's nakedness in the arena, the senator's forced confession, the Christian martyr's composure, all were rehearsals for the moral spectacles we perform daily. Every time humiliation becomes a form of proof, of guilt, of virtue, of allegiance, the empire stirs beneath our skin. The mechanics are ancient, but the medium is new. Even the language of justice still carries Roman bones. We make examples of people. We cleanse institutions. We expose corruption. Each phrase is a fossil of Roman ideology, the belief that purity can be achieved through public degradation. We have inherited not just their roads and ruins, but their logic. In this invisible empire, the Colosseum has expanded until it covers the world. We stream pain as if it were penance, dissect tragedy for meaning, applaud downfall as moral instruction. We call it culture, debate, transparency. Rome would have called it governance. There is a cruel symmetry to this continuity. The same civilization that invented citizenship also invented humiliation as civic duty. To belong, one must witness another's fall. To remain safe, one must perform compliance. The crowd does not need to believe. It only needs to participate. Rome taught the world that collective cruelty feels righteous when choreographed properly. And yet, the same flaw that doomed the empire haunts its descendants. The mirror eventually turns inward. The system that weaponizes exposure cannot survive its own reflection. When everyone becomes visible, everyone becomes vulnerable. Rome collapsed not because it ran out of enemies, but because it ran out of spectators. Its citizens grew exhausted by the performance, hollowed by the endless need to appear loyal. So too with us. Our empires of display, digital, political, ideological, feed on attention until they starve empathy. The crowd that once cheered in the Colosseum now scrolls in silence, its satisfaction as brief as the life of a post. We have traded blood for pixels, but the transaction is the same. Suffering turned into spectacle, morality outsourced to reaction. The empire never ended. It adapted. It wears democracy as disguise, technology as crown, entertainment as creed. Its citizens no longer fear the emperor. They fear obscurity. Lucia's body vanished centuries ago, but her story lingers because it reveals the truth. Rome tried to bury. That power survives only by teaching people to mistake cruelty for virtue. Every civilization inherits that lesson. Most repeat it. The ledgers are still open. The crowd is still watching. And when the bones finally speak, they will not tell us of Rome's fall, but of its persistence. The ruins of Rome are silent, but they were never still. Every arch, every corridor of the Colosseum still breathes the sound of what it was built to contain: applause. Tourists walk where senators once sat, holding cameras where magistrates once held decrees. They say they are witnessing history, but history is witnessing them. The eyes carved into the marble reliefs still look outward, asking the same question that haunted the empire's spectators. Are you entertained, or are you complicit? 2,000 years have passed since Lucia stood beneath the sun, her body turned into an example. The empire that condemned her has vanished, its emperors reduced to myths, its laws to dust. And yet, when you stand in the Colosseum and whisper, your voice carries upward, amplified by stone shaped to project suffering. The architecture still performs. Rome engineered a machine that outlived its operators. Archaeologists call it acoustics. Philosophers might call it memory. But for the dead, it is vengeance. Across history, every civilization that inherited Rome also inherited its moral theater. The Spanish Inquisition burned heretics in plazas built on Roman foundations. The British Empire paraded colonized subjects through London in triumphs, eerily similar to Caesar's. The French Revolution executed nobles in crowds that shouted the same word the Romans once used: justice. Each believed they were building something new. Each was simply replaying the script. Lucia's scream, Perpetua's prayer, the silence of the nameless condemned, all became the language through which the West learned to think about power. To govern meant to display. To display meant to degrade. The empire may have died, but its logic became the bloodstream of civilization. Rome's genius lay not in conquering territory, but in colonizing the imagination. It taught that cruelty could be organized, justified, moralized. It built a world where law could be worshipped like God, and obedience could be disguised as virtue. When we stand before its ruins, we are not looking at the past. We are looking into a mirror polished by millennia of justification. The marble does not accuse, it remembers. Every groove on those stones is a ledger entry. The faint etching of iron chains, the marks of beasts' claws, the footprints of actors who played executioners. They remind us that civilization's greatest illusion is moral distance. We think we have left Rome behind because our tools are different. But cruelty does not require swords. It only requires spectators. The empire of mirrors has perfected what Rome began. Our punishments now wear the language of empathy. Our spectacles, the language of justice. We record cruelty not to prevent it, but to consume it safely. We turn every tragedy into a narrative, every death into content, every humiliation into data. Rome used sand, we use pixels. The stage is infinite now, and no one ever leaves it. The question is no longer who the victim is, but who the crowd becomes. The Romans believed the arena purified the people. Today, we believe the same when we destroy reputations, cancel, expose, humiliate in the name of truth. The technology changed, The theology did not. Rome's architects could not have dreamed of such perfection. An empire where every citizen carries their own Colosseum, where every gaze is a weapon and every silence an act of compliance. The spectacle no longer requires emperors because we have learned to rule ourselves through fear of visibility. The chains have become internal. Yet, even within that machinery, fragments of resistance survive, quiet, defiant, persistent. A woman in Carthage who refused to renounce her faith, a slave in Gaul who smiled as he was branded, a senator's daughter who looked into the crowd and refused to bow. They did not win. They were not meant to. But each left an imprint in the stone, a refusal recorded in the same language as power itself. When the archaeologists brush the dust from a broken face, they are not just uncovering a statue. They are confronting the empire's unfinished conversation with guilt. Every fragment is a reply. We remember you. The empire tried to erase its victims by turning them into symbols. Instead, the symbols became its condemnation. Lucia's body was supposed to teach obedience. Instead, it taught continuity, the way pain travels through time, reshaping each generation that inherits it. What Rome never understood was that its archives of cruelty would one day serve as its confession. The ledgers it kept with pride, execution lists, amphitheater accounts, temple inventories, now stand as evidence. The system that once measured obedience now proves its own perversion. The bones it tried to silence have become historians, and they are still speaking. They speak through the cracked mosaics that depict nameless captives, through the fragments of chains displayed in museums, through the words of those who study them, not as legends, but as ledgers. The empire's victims have no tombs, yet their record endures in the thing Rome prized most: documentation. Every civilization believes it is more moral than the last. Every empire believes its cruelty is justified. Rome's mistake was not its brutality, it was its honesty. It wrote everything down. And so we inherit both its glory and its guilt. We cannot burn the Colosseum. We can only choose whether to keep building it. Out of laws, out of language, out of spectacle. Every time humiliation becomes virtue, every time we demand that pain be public, every time we equate visibility with truth, we lay another stone on Rome's foundation. The ruins do not warn, they mirror. When you stand before them, the wind passes through the corridors like breath through a sleeping giant. If you listen carefully, beneath the noise of the city, you can still hear it. The faint roar of a crowd rehearsing its righteousness. And somewhere in that echo, between the stones and the silence, the bones speak. We were the price of order. Do not make us your example again.